Good morning, everyone. That's managed to come here this beautiful sunny morning and cold in Vienna, but fresh and nice. And we have a second day of our Innovation and Startup program, which is a specific strand in this conference, ICT2018. And today we are going to have a specific focus on investment, on growth strategies, and the scale-up issues. We have identified, of course, like yourself probably have, that there is an important need right now to invest in disruptive technologies. It's part of one of the proposals that the European Commission has put forward for the next budgetary framework of the EU to invest more in what we call deep tech technologies, which is quite necessary to improve the competitiveness of the European Union. We have identified sort of three issues that we would like to address with the program today. One is about the investment gap that we will have a discussion around in the first panel of speakers. The investment gap is to actually get the investment to these deep tech technologies and finding the ways to get links between the investors and these communities. And then we have also a sort of knowledge gap whereby the investment communities perhaps would need a bit more knowledge about these deep technologies and what they can offer. What kind of value propositions are there, and what kind of companies and technologies are actually bankable? Because of course we're talking about high risk investments. So we would like also with this sort of gatherings and meetings to get everyone up to a higher level of understanding of the technologies and the opportunities there. And thirdly, we have what we call a scale-up gap. This is in the growth phase of the companies, a problem, in fact, to scale up the company into becoming larger actors. We have quite a good startup community in Europe. We have identified that we're now almost at pair with the US in terms of startup creation, but actually getting these startups to grow and take the size of unicorns is where we have the issues. So that's also something we will address during this program today. So we have three different viewpoints, and I will, without further ado, because I'm sure you want to get into the substance immediately, turn over to my colleague Søren Giegler, who has organized the program today and will be moderating also the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. So we're excited to have this panel, and maybe at the starting point, I wanted to bring out some data, actually from the EIF. So the venture capital market has really boomed in Europe, has developed quite a lot. I think it has more or less doubled from about, maybe you have the data better than me, but between around, say, 7 to 17 billion. The issue is that China, in the same time, has increased its venture capital market tenfold, from 7 to 70 billion. So basically, in the area of, we are talking of artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, is an important challenge we are facing. So there are tremendous opportunities, but maybe right at the beginning also wanted to put out the challenge we have. So we do find an investment gap. That was the first finding. But now, without more talks, we wanted to go right into our conversation. So please ask questions. We want to make it as interactive as possible. And I just wanted to quickly introduce our panel members. So to my right is Jane Treadwell. So Jane is the practice manager of digital development for the World Bank and has many years of experience as an executive for the Australian government. She's been the CIO and deputy CEO of digital business. So she has a government perspective, and now she works for the World Bank and advises governments around the world on the use of digital. So to my left, we have Dirk Werner. He is the director and head of the ICT department at the EBRD in London. So he has worked many years in investment banking before joining the EBRD, and now is leading the EBRD's program, all on basically managing the investment strategy. Then to my left, further, is Henry Hakomo from TESI. So some of you might not yet know TESI. I'm sure you can explain, but basically it's a state-owned investment company in Finland, and the mission is exactly to increase the venture capital market and private equity market in Finland, particularly also towards growth finance. So, and last but not least, we have Uli Grabenwater. He's the head of investment, technology and innovation at the EIF, and has worked many years also in strategic development, EU policies, and previously at the EBRD, and at the EIB. And I saw that you have a degree from Graz, a master's degree in economics, I think, and business. So thank you so much for being with us. So now, maybe let me first turn to Jane. So you work day to day on advising governments. So now, can you share with us some experiences on regulatory framework? Like, what is enabling environment for digital development?
Thank you, and it's great to be here. The bank has focused in the last few years on the growth in the digital economy and the way in which the developing world can actually take advantage of technology in its known state, as well as the emerging technologies, in order that, as we say, countries can leapfrog on the backs and the investments of other countries in learning how best to apply different forms of technology to solve critical problems for their nations. The World Development Report in 2016 highlighted that digital dividends to any country is a product of both technology, but also the non-technology or analog environment, which includes the way in which institutions behave and interact and adapt to a new technology environment, the skills of people as well as civil servants and ministers in understanding how the digital world is changing what they do, and then the regulations and policy arena. We describe this as the enabling environment, and it's crucial in some of the closed countries that are sort of now starting to open up to look at the way in which the private sector actually has the confidence to invest into these countries where there's competition and open markets. So therefore, you know, for example, in a country in Central Asia, whilst they want to be part of the new world, whilst, you know, they are looking at perhaps China that has engaged the World Bank in helping identify the new drivers of growth within which the disruptive technologies or emerging technologies are critical drivers. In order for these technologies, or even the standard ones that advanced countries are using, that enabling environment to support more stability for investment, more confidence in terms of knowledge of and access to how personal information is actually handled, and the way in which a range of regulations, not just in the telecom space, but as we now know, this impacts every layer and type of interaction and industries. So the digital finance arena is impacting consumer protection, environment safeguards, cybersecurity elements, and so this is what we describe and work with the countries to actually provide a suitable environment so that not only do investors have confidence, but people have confidence in the way in which they can access services with confidence, both in government and the private companies. It's exciting when a government actually wants to do this fast, and we are working on regulatory roadmaps for Uzbekistan, and one of our saboteurs is here. But it's also not just the developing countries, and so we've been drawing on the experiences of Korea and Japan to actually both enlighten and share knowledge with the developing countries, but also so they can find out what others are doing in this space. And I suppose the biggest excitement is the way in which some of the disruptive technologies may well accelerate and amplify some of the aspirations of these countries, but in so doing, the conditions need to be suitable and supportive. Thanks.
So you mentioned to me yesterday digital by default. That some countries, what do you mean by that? That people really see the leapfrogging, that digital now will enable them to right away go into the fourth industrial revolution? Is that the ambition?
I think digital by default, certainly when I was a Chief Information Officer and working across many countries, many governments have realised that it's a high cost to do face-to-face service delivery or even contact centres, and that if you actually look for seamless service experiences, both by business and citizens, instead of investing in all channels at once, if you go to the digital channel for the high volume, probably low value transactions, where there may well be platforms now that integrate across all of government, that you don't have to duplicate investments from a government perspective, and where citizens and businesses can get the same experience. They actually know how to deal with government in a particular way. This saves costs for government. It actually lifts the trust through transparency, and it can concentrate where there might be face-to-face services required on the more complex areas. Digital by default, privacy by design. These are some of the ways in which we're advising countries now to actually not just leapfrog, but learn from the experiences of others, that instead of where maybe Singapore and Korea spent 40 years in their digital journey, they can do it in 5.
Thank you. So let us face and move to Finland. So, Henry, I wanted to ask you, in Finland you have quite successful innovation ecosystem. So where also you and the government play a, I think, vital role in supporting startups and growth financing. So what do you think some lessons learned from Finland, and to what extent or not you think they can be transferred to other countries, say particularly in Eastern and Central Europe?
Yes, first of all, Finland is a small country. We have only 5.7 million people, so it's we need to be competitive with everything what we do. And what comes to innovation ecosystems, we have success stories and failures. Mostly the failures are regarding when politics or politicians decide to do something and innovations are not following that path. If you want to create innovation ecosystems, you need to have at least one of three ingredients. One is access to unique talent pool, which is available. What happened to us when Nokia mobiles collapsed? We suddenly had a good pool of talent focused on technology and especially telecommunications, and that created, for example, one innovation ecosystem which is based in Oulu and which provided a very good standpoint. Second, where we have been successful in creating innovative ecosystems around the industry clusters where we have world-class knowledge, for example, maritime industry, where we are now combining traditional industry with high-tech companies in order to formulate the viable ecosystem. And for example, yesterday we did the first fully autonomous AI-based ferry test with Rolls-Royce, and that has been something that you need to focus that you have enough verticals in the industry cluster in order to create the holistic innovation ecosystem. And the third one is the research, where we have been, as a small country, we need to focus our resources we need to be focused. And for example, in optics, we have been able to create, not even in Helsinki, but we've been able to create the industry cluster which really provides world-class innovations, and around that it's much easier to build the ecosystem. Maybe something what can be transferred globally is our Aalto University concept. It's the university established around 10 years ago, which combined three leading schools in Helsinki, our capital, our leading business school, leading engineering school, and leading art school, and provided multidisciplinary school with low boundaries of collaborating between different disciplinaries, and that has actually yielded quite a lot of good tangible results in Finland. For example, Slush, I don't know how many of you have heard, but it's one of the biggest VC events, fully led by students. So it's not from the government side that we are only providing a little bit that they can grow and create the environment, but we have given the students power or empowered them to create something truly unique. And that's maybe some lesson learned, that if you want to have real change, it needs to start from bottom up and from students especially. And that's something what maybe can be transferred, that in university level, don't stay on silos or inside the silos. You need to combine both business, technology, as well as arts together in order to create something innovative. And maybe.
Thank you. So maybe let's move to the EIF and Uli. So there are huge opportunities in disruptive technologies. Everybody now talks about AI, blockchain. There's some hype around it. But why do you think there's still this issue about the investment gap? And what are some of the challenges for investors to really understand those technologies, to assess the technology, and to manage the risk?
Yeah, I think there are two dimensions to the answer to your question. I think there's one that is a question of the approach that we're taking to the value of disruptive technologies in the first place. I think when we're talking about the scaling of this industry and the role it is going to play for our economic constellation going forward, we need to change perspective even in asking us the question of today differently. Because we're asking us the question of how can we close the gap? Actually, it is not about closing the gap. If we want to be leader in disruptive technologies in the world, we need to be better than just closing the gap. And I think that is an issue that we have not only in the policy-making era, it is something that we actually as a continent have as a task altogether. When we talk about opportunities in disruptive technologies, let us observe the continents and geographies that you have been mentioning in your introduction. You said that China was moving by a factor of 10, while we have been doubling. We know that the United States are running ahead of us ever since we can remember. And while we are actually busy with trying to figure out how we are going to close the gap, China is actually working on the next lead. Because if you look at value creation in an economy over the history of humans, we had the era pre-industrial revolution, where actually value creation was based by the factor of labor, access to labor. With the industrial revolution, we have moved into value creation through access to capital. We are currently in the process of having a society where competitiveness is based on knowledge. We are trying to close the knowledge gap today, while China is working on the next distinctive factor for competitiveness, which is access to natural resources. And while we are trying to close the knowledge gap, they actually are buying up all the access to natural resources at the globe, because once that artificial intelligence has actually kicked in and made knowledge a commodity, we're going to have a different game to play. And while we are discussing this discussion on how to make disruptive technologies excel in Europe, I think that is something that we need to take into account. We need to have a kind of collective effort from all the stakeholders of the society, including corporates, to today see disruptive technologies as competition. Actually, it's not competition, it's their only means of survival going forward, and I think this is the kind of mindset that we need to get to.
Thank you. So may I ask you a follow-up question on that? So, because we talk a lot about the market failure. That basically there's a market failure, and if there's a market failure, then we have EU action and programs and investments through public funding. But wouldn't it be rather about something like market creation? So should we help to create a market for AI in Europe?
Yeah, I think it's the market will create itself if you give the market the opportunity to create itself. I don't think that you can design market creation by policy, but you can do everything you can in creating an environment where that happens. And actually, the cooperation that we have with the European Commission since 2000, where we basically have, with the resources of the European Commission, have rebuilt a venture capital ecosystem in Europe, that is a very important part to it. But if we move forward and look at what is next, we need actually, with the support also of the member states for the action of the European Union, create a different mindset, which is equity culture driven. We cannot actually rely on artificial intelligence to prosper and to carry through the European economy if we are not setting the right incentives for having that cultural change, this change to an equity-based culture where actually people take risk. And we are having a financial system where we see more and more of the economy in disruptive technologies, notably, being considered as non-bankable because too risky. Well, we need to understand that we are today living in an environment where a normal business life cycle is 5 years. And 5 years of history for no bank actually is enough to judge that a company is bankable. So we need to find other means of funding those companies to bring them from zero to global category leaders, and that's where we are lagging behind.
Thank you. So now I'm coming to Dirk from the EBRD. So We also have a major issue about the continuous investment and digital divide within Europe. So while the data actually show that around 80 to even 90% of companies working in an AI and disruptive technologies are focused in clusters. So London, Paris, Berlin, but what are the challenges? And you're working a lot in Central and Eastern Europe. So what are your experiences of investment opportunities in the region?
Yeah, thank you very much, Søren. I mean, the EBRD is probably better known as a lender, and we don't have a global remit. We're primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia also, Southeastern Europe, some selected North African, Middle Eastern countries. So the countries that have a challenge in developing the private sector to begin with, what I oversee, what's maybe more interesting for the discussion here and perhaps a little less known about the EBRD, that we're also venture capital investors. We have a dedicated fund for direct investments in venture capital opportunities. In addition to that, we have a fund of funds business that invests in venture capital funds. The challenges that my fellow speakers have mentioned overall are of course multiplied in our countries, in the countries of operation of the EBRD, where the development from a bricks and mortar economy to a digital economy lags far behind. The challenges are that if you think about the providers of venture capital, these are the largest US investors, European investors. They need to deploy hundreds of millions in order to deploy their funds. They don't look necessarily at small opportunities with a couple of $1 million in Romania, in Belarus, the Ukraine. So there's first of all a funding gap because the talent is there. These countries have actually an extraordinary talent pool, not dissimilar to Finland, I would say, where people come from excellent university programs. So the talent is there. The business models they pursue are essentially adaptations of things that already exist. It is online platforms for digital media. It is online platforms for transport, for doctor bookings, for online fashion, for e-commerce. So proven business models, but that need to be adapted to our specific regions. But the funding is missing. We come in not as a seed funder, but we come in as the first institutional funder. So at a stage where companies have revenues, have a proven business model, not profitable necessarily, but at least something which is a validated model. We come in up to 10 million euros, but this is very large for the opportunities we have in our country. So it's typically the 2 or 3 million euro institutional money that is taking the company to the next step. We bring international investors alongside us. These are people who don't have an original focus on our countries, but they come in with someone like us who knows the infrastructure very well, the political environment, and they try to play a little bit. So we are a catalyst, and we can therefore basically bridge the funding gap more than anything else. Why is this important? Because the scale-up of these companies is where many of them fail. As I said, the technology works fairly well. People are very smart. They are very good software engineers. But to scale it up beyond a small region, they need to go global or at least European-wide, and for that they need a sales force. And many of them think very early on they want to bring their business to the United States, which is the largest market, of course. But imagine how difficult it is to put up a sales force in a country that knows nothing about your little company, and how do you get the respective managers. So these are things where we can also help on advice. And maybe we talk a little bit about this later, but I think the message here is the challenges is to find capital from global sources that don't typically focus on the Central Eastern European countries and forget about the Central Asian countries. This is where the EBRD comes in.
Thank you. And we'll follow up on more questions later. But now wanted to turn to Jane again. So one of the issues we also talk a lot that there is a skills gap. So a lot of companies have been talking that they don't find enough skilled people to work on disruptive technologies. And but I also wanted to bring in the issue of how do we improve digital skills of more the traditional sectors. So it's not just, so it's like, how do we break with the tech bubble? So we have like the technology hubs, the tech, but we have in each country, I was just participating in the German Digital Summit this week, and Ms. Merkel gave the keynote speech, and half her speech was about construction companies, basically about the industrial base in Germany, and which is still not digitized. So even in Germany right now, only around 15% of SMEs are digitalized. So how do you see this gap between the high-tech sector and the more traditional economy, and how could we better bridge this gap?
Thanks. I get the good questions, and in fact, it actually reflects on this digital economy framework of the bank, which actually acknowledges that skills and literacy, both real and then digital, are absolutely crucial. And in fact, we're concentrating many of the interventions, activities, and lending projects on, it's no good just sort of digging trenches for fibre optic cable unless you've actually got skilled people that know how to use it. And your point about traditional industries and becoming digitalised is really interesting. I remember when I was in the Australian government, and 20 years ago we did a survey of small business and said, do you want to sell online? They said yes. Do you have a website? No. Do you have a computer? No. I'm glad to say that that's all changed, but I think the way in which traditional businesses actually understand that they can be part of a digital economy, that they can actually build, or their governments can build relationships in a regional mechanism that can give them the lift to move into that digital economy is crucial. And the know-how and skills are also really important. We create components in our lending that ensure that the people in government and in the ICT sector or the ICT digital enabled sector are skilled in order to take advantage of these investments. That can be block training, and of course the whole nature of the ecosystem is crucial. You can't just actually throw skills at people and expect that to work, and being applied and active and supported in terms of what they learn, then how they apply it is crucial. Without customers that know how to turn on their smartphone or access websites or buy services and products, you can't be very successful. So of course, finding ways to support the sort of digital skills is crucial as users. And in fact, the Alibaba experience in China with their kiosks, where they thought they were creating kiosks that people could in villages could buy their products, have actually turned some of those buyers into sellers in terms of much skill and opportunities, so that this is having a powerful impact on poverty in rural China. I think one of the most exciting activities my team has done in Kosovo was persuading the minister that investing in broadband in rural Kosovo was going to be not a benefit for the next government, but in fact could be a benefit for the existing government, where we created collaboration across tertiary education, trainers in digital freelancing, the women in 3 villages, to the point where within 6 months many of them had jobs. So I think the critical thing is actually understanding that an ecosystem will be both the contributor and the beneficiary of the way in which we all go digital, and just one quick thing, because you mentioned mindsets. Mindsets are crucial in this sort of repositioning of leaders, be they in industry or government, that the mindset around this connections and means are absolutely crucial. Thanks.
Thank you. So, but there's also a skills gap in the investors community, it seems. Or maybe we have to see. So we basically developed with EIB several market assessments, which actually showed that there was a big gap in the knowledge of investors on how to assess technology. So I wanted to ask you, what could be done? You know, you already mentioned bankable project. We have to change the mindset. We have to better, you know, that the investor community has to better connect to innovators. So in China, for instance, I took a look at their innovation, so digital innovation hubs. So in each hub, each tech hub in China is actually an investment community, part of the hub. And so how do you see that issue of how could we bring investors closer to the innovators?
Well, I think if we're looking at capital at scale, and that's basically what we're talking about here, you need to create incentives for capital to flow into that direction. And I'm not talking about removing downside risk or subsidizing returns. I think the venture capital industry in Europe has made its proof over the last decade or so that it is an asset class that can withstand the comparison to any other asset class, even on a risk-adjusted basis, or maybe particularly on a risk-adjusted basis, because if you compare private equity to venture capital and you adjust for the leverage that currently is plowed into private equity, then you probably get a very different perspective on any return comparison. But what I'm saying with that is when we look at the big pools of money that we have to support a digital economy evolution and revolution, we're talking about pension funds, we talk about insurance companies, and to a lesser extent actually about banks, because most of those risk profiles, as I said before, are not meant for a banking portfolio. And if we look at those big communities of pension funds and insurance companies and the regulatory environment that they are in and what they have to comply with in terms of ensuring the risk profile that they're actually allowed to be investing in, there's very, very little incentive for any of those stakeholders to take a meaningful stake in venture capital that backs this type of companies. Because it is not only massively expensive in terms of the equity allocation that they need to make towards those asset classes, but on top of it, and that's maybe linking to the previous question, it is massively expensive to invest there because you do need knowledge to invest reasonably in venture capital and in technology companies. And actually we have been building at EIF, we're building our knowledge to select fund managers of institutional investment quality ourselves over basically 2 decades. And if you look at that in this context of the size of the venture capital industry in Europe today, and you reflect on a 100 billion asset manager to make an allocation of, say, 1% to the asset class of venture capital, and you compare of what that means in manpower to actually create the market intelligence in-house to do that, it's a big stretch. And that's the reason why I'm saying that you need to create incentives that go beyond downside risk protection or return enhancement. There may be ways of finding incentives in giving returns that you generate through IPO investments in disruptive technologies with tax breaks and things like that, where actually there becomes a kind of stream of arguments that actually make it more attractive for these type of industries to invest at scale. And we do, when we talk about funding the disruptive technologies in the digital economy today, we are talking about investment rounds north of 100 million. We have roughly 80 unicorns in Europe, of which less than 10 actually have been led in the last financing round by a European VC. And if you look at the number of VCs in Europe that actually have the scale to lead such a round, you don't need the fingers of one hand. And that's something which it's a massive disadvantage that Europe has over the United States.
So moving back to Dirk, because you are taking a stake, as you just said, through VC investment, so you're the institutional investor for many of those companies. So, but I was really curious, so how do you identify, what criteria do you use to find companies where you think this is a company which you think has real potential to grow in, and you are investing in them proactively?
I mean, that is probably the most difficult question, because despite the fact that everybody's talking about unicorns and the unicorns are the successful investment stories, a multitude of that number of, never gets off the ground. We have in our portfolio, it's a small practice in reality, we have 15 companies in which we invested over 4 years, but we have scanned 1,200 opportunities. So the funnel to go to 1,200 companies via public information, via referrals, via the analysis of the business cases to basically come up with 15 investable cases shows you a little bit the challenge. So what we look at is, number one, what is the product? Is there a market for the product or the service? Is there something that has sort of a precedent where we know it works? For example, the Uber type adaptation to our markets, the online fashion, an e-commerce platform, a traffic information system, a doctor's appointment website. So the first thing is there a service that is relevant? Is there a market that is actually scalable? And who else is in this market? Am I going to be competed out of that market very early on, or do I have a real chance? And I think the ultimate test is always the quality of the management, and that's a very subjective assessment. We need to be convinced that the management believes in their own hockey stick. You know, as a conventional private equity investor, you do not invest in hockey sticks because it's very unbelievable. But startups by nature do not have a historical track record. So there we need to convince essentially about the market potential. And the market potential a lot has to do with scaling up via sales. Because as I said before, and I think this is probably also among your experiences a little bit, getting the technology right is the first step. This is where the idea is born. But how does that translate into money is how can you sell it? And how can you scale it up? How can you approach the market and the investors and the consumers? And that is one of the challenges that companies face, and where most of them, quite frankly, fail, because that scale up cannot happen at a time when you are still dependent on family and friends' money or your own resources. It needs to happen just before you ask for institutional money, like the EBRD's money, because we look for the realization of those potentials. Now, I should say though, because some of my colleagues actually mentioned this as well, it is important that the ecosystem is the right one. So in addition to investing, we're also engaging in what we call policy dialogue, where we have discussions with regulators, with government agencies to basically provide a competitive environment, provide a regulatory framework, which is very similar to what we see in the European Union, to basically entice competition, to further it, and to make sure that people have an incentive in invest. And at the first step, it also means, as Jane said, we need to have the infrastructure in place. We do need to have the broadband. We do need to have all that in place that allows you to put your applications onto it. This is maybe another part of the EBRD's investment. This is where we are lending, but that's clearly part of the enabling initiatives.
Thank you. So more than 1,000 companies, and you go down to 15. Now moving to Henry, I was really intrigued. You're the Chief Digital Officer in Tessie. So Tessie, by the way, is, maybe you can explain more, but it has, as I understand it, investment portfolio of 1.2 billion euros. So, but what are in your day-to-day work? What are the challenges you face as a, if I want to say, technology representative or ambassador with your colleagues with this conversation? So, you know, with your investment colleagues who come to this from the investment side, how do you convince them to invest in a company you really feel from a technology angle it has a lot of potential, and they have serious doubts about, say, management or the viability of the project?
So what we do with our direct investments, we are always the co-investor. So what are we trying to get is the lead investor, whether it's the global or local. And as a public, providing public funding, we are a bit more patient. So when we are investing in the tech companies, we can be there a bit longer time, as well as go through different rounds, because we do have quite wide resources. And when we are talking about, I don't know, the latest example was the satellite company called ICE. And for example, they are now building the global satellite system in order to monitor this, the global with SAR satellite technology. And when we go to those cases, we are trying to bridge the gap and to make market work. We don't want to interfere the private sector. We want to share the risk with them. And then where we can provide our professionalism is to how we can evaluate those companies and how we can attract the talent from the global market to Finland and help them to evaluate the companies.
Thank you. So I think now we have heard from all of us, and it's time for you to ask questions. So please identify yourself, and we have a round of 3-4 questions on, please.
Hello. Yes, my name is Giuseppe Padula. I come from University of Bologna and from the Emilia-Romagna, and we are working in a very holistic or systematic way just to increase the digital transformation of our district. It was very, very much interesting, I mean, all the consideration, because I think that the question of, especially of creating the market intelligence in this transformation is really crucial. Because I remember one of the first papers of the McKinsey about, it was 2011 something, about the digital transformation, and the company had to report in a separate note what it was a CNC. It means that, let's say, the approach of evaluations of transformation must go back again on the technology, and not like before in the last 20 years. It was, I mean, the typical approach that was not dependent from what the companies were doing. There were only evaluation with some specific metrics or analysis. Now it's very important to know what they are going to do, and also for working for a market that is not still open probably. And so this is, I mean, probably one of the main gap, the creation of market intelligence. So the question is, how could it, in order to accelerate this creation of market intelligence, to share the risks together with corporates? So what I think is about the, let's say, the corporate to finance, not directly the company, but some corporate accelerators. Of course, there are already some examples, and you share the, let's say, the risk with the knowledge of that is as broad still the corporation itself. So there is a sharing of risks between the knowledge of the company, and this is the case of Trumpf, for instance, that they have done a startup, Axum, and it has been, let's say, a sharing in that.
one, two more questions, please. Yeah, here in the first row.
Hi, Panis from Disrupt Europe. Okay, I know the discussion is about closing the gap and the investment in the disruptive technologies, but how actually you identify disruptive startups or disruptive technologies? Because if you have read Innovation Dilemma by Clay Christensen, the guy that actually coined disruption and the disruptive theory, it's very difficult to identify, and I would like to have your comment on that, how you're using any tools, how you identify disruptive technologies and disruptive startups to invest.
Thank you. Maybe one more? Another question? Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, Paul and Liu from the European Investment Bank. I have a question concerning the developing countries, because you said that you have projects in these countries, and my question is that I just wonder, is this digital transformation, is this an opportunity for these countries to catch up with the society and with the economy to the industrialized countries? Or is the digital transformation broaden the digital gap in this country? So is this digital transformation and mean that they can do better in the future, or is this something that they have to be afraid of, and so because they will lag behind in the future, and they will be maybe excluded from the benefits of the digital world? Thank you.
So, thank you. So who would like to answer the first question about the role of corporate investors?
I think that the role of corporates is, we've discussed it from different angles already before. It's crucial in getting this movement going. But I think what we need to manage to convey that it is not crucial for the sake of the disruptive potential of the digital economy. It is crucial for the survival of the existing landscape of companies. I think we had the example in the beginning of what sparked the development of the Finnish innovation system. It was the decline of a world leader in technology, which was Nokia. And actually, them having missed the train in what went on in the development of GSM smartphones and the like, has actually freed the potential of a country to not repeat that mistake again. And I think this is something which we need to bring home to many of the industries that today actually are bunkering in business models that they know are going to be outdated in 5 years' time, but still hang on to them, fending off what is happening in the digital economy space, but know perfectly that it's just delaying the day where they have to face it.
Thank you. So maybe the second question and comment on the first.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add really is the role of the corporates, of course, and also the establishment of these accelerators and similar platforms is crucial to basically nurture it. But the role of the corporates is also tricky, because as an entrepreneur, an inventor, an owner, you also are in there with your own objectives. You want to maintain control, you want to maximize your value. Once you become part of a corporate, or a corporate gets too much involved and you become internalized, this entrepreneurial upside is gone. So I think in that regard, the role of corporates has to be quite cautious. So how do we assess who we invest in? As I said, we look at 1,200, we invest in 15, and we're also learning while we do it. And we're not scientists, we're bankers, we are not the entrepreneurs, but we need to sort of, at our level, understand where the opportunity is. We conduct due diligence with clients and users of the applications, for example, or the services that these companies offer. We have extensive discussions with management. We look at comparable companies that already exist. Either they are publicly listed, but in the United States, for example. We do an extraordinary amount of analysis on, you know, what are the metrics, what drives revenues, what is the cost structure you need, and not so much based on historical experience, but on precedents to understand if this has a chance. And because it's venture capital, there is, of course, a high risk that this doesn't work. We have a very sophisticated advisory board, the EBRD, consisting of external seasoned venture capitalists who, quite frankly, have seen a lot. So it's a little bit of experience rather than pure analysis that leads you to ultimately do what's always a little bit of a leap of faith, and that's the nature of venture investing.
Thank you. So now I think the last question is probably for you, Jane. So what is the potential for leapfrogging of, that's at least I understood the question.
The potential is high, at least conceptually, and then we deal with the sort of the mechanisms by which that gap can be closed, when in fact digital inclusion is getting harder to achieve than easier. And therefore, the World Bank with its partners has actually committed to very big stretch goals for Africa in terms of doubling connectivity in the next 3 years, which is actually an acceleration of what's actually been happening over the last 10. The World Bank President Jim Kim a few years ago talked about the convergence of aspirations. So now, as a result of the internet and shared information, people in the poorest village of Africa can still have the aspirations of a better life because they can see what someone in Scandinavia is living by. But do they have the means by which that can be achieved? And the fear, perhaps before there's been much more recent research on the impact of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and these various disruptive and constructive technologies, has been, has the sort of approach to low-value type industrialization and manufacturing has typically been the means by which developing countries can claw their way out of low income status. But the newer information is that with investment in human capital, in looking at the way in which countries actually start educating their children at very young ages and recognise lifelong learning will be the means by which people can actually be part of a different type of society, and where it's not just the training but access to healthcare, and those opportunities can lift and provide the means by which people can get out of poverty. So the sort of changing nature of work that many institutions and think tanks are sort of highlighting the opportunity, and it comes back to that skill question before, is an issue. Doing this cannot be done by single countries. It actually takes, I suppose the old thing, it used to take a village to look after children. It'll take a lot of collaboration across many institutions and countries to attend to this. The option of not doing anything is not, I think the world is already experiencing some impact of looking at the difference in life choices and opportunities that various people and countries have. So we work together to help solve this.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank all of you for participating, and our panelists. Thank you so much. But I also wanted to mention to you that tomorrow we are announcing the EU Coordinated Action Plan for Artificial Intelligence. So I hope this is just the first conversation we're having with you, because we are actually working a lot on a specific dedicated investment platform for AI and blockchain, also with the EIF and national promotional banks. So our objective is that in a year, 2 years from now, we can actually have a conversation with you about how this new instrument we are just developing now is working how we can improve it, but we are basically putting in place one instrument which hopefully will contribute towards addressing the challenge we just discussed. Thank you so much.